Hi everybody, it's Rob Hill here from PageUp and welcome to our Talent Lab webinar today. So before we get going, I'm going to take you through a few housekeeping items and then introduce you to Sylvia Borhauser-Smith, who's running our Talent Lab webinar today. So in terms of the housekeeping, today everybody's in listen-only mode. So that means that you're obviously able to hear us, but you also actually are able to contribute. You'll be able to ask questions and make comments using the sidebar of the actual GoToMeeting itself. So please do feel free to ask questions along the way. And we'll also have some polls throughout our webinar today where you'll be able to contribute too. We'll attempt to answer as many questions as possible, and if we don't get to yours, we do apologise up front, but we do promise that someone from our team will connect with you following the session today and make sure we get back to you with an answer. Today we're going to try and keep the session to approximately 50 minutes, so make sure we get across the full story, but as I said, there'll be follow-up as well, and you'll also be able to access a recording of the webinar within a couple of days of our session today. So in terms of our webinar host, I'm pleased to be able to introduce Sylvia Borhauser-Smith, who actually leads their PageUp global research function and actually has over 25 years experience in HR and talent management. Sylvia has qualifications in business, psychology and neuroscience, and she's currently championing the PageUp Talent Lab, so helping to prepare public and private and non-for-profit organisations for the future of work. So here to find the findings from the first lab and the implications for higher ed, I'd like to introduce you to Sylvia. Sylvia, what are some of the questions that have been addressed by the PageUp Talent Lab?
Yeah, hi Rob, and hi to everyone. It's really great to be here. I think it's just such a fascinating time, well, A, to be alive and B, to be at work, because there's so much change and there's so many advances in both science and technology that are really bringing about what's being talked about as the second machine age. So we're going to explore some of that today and the implications for every industry, every sector, which is being disrupted by that.
Great, can't wait.
I think there's also quite a distinct impact on the higher education sector as well, even if you look at how the funding models of institutions are changing and the flexible and online delivery mechanisms that are now changing how education is delivered. I think it's a really exciting time, not just for industries generally, but particularly for the higher education sector.
Yeah.
Okay, well, one of the big questions that I ask myself when I think about the work of the future is whether I'll actually have a job. I think one of the big questions that we all need to be asking ourselves is to what extent will work change and what does that mean for each of us as individuals, let alone for the organisations and institutions that we work for. So I guess what you don't want to be is like this guy. And he's obviously been extinct for quite a while, and what we find is that jobs have actually been going extinct for many centuries now, and so the actual idea of jobs becoming extinct is not new to us, but we're in an evolution that is quite different from the past. So if we have a little look at the past, what we see is that industries that have evolved over time have changed quite significantly. If you were around in the year 1500, Rob, chances are you would have been employed in the agriculture sector. 75% of the US population were. But by 1800, that had already dropped to 35%.
Wow, yeah.
By the mid-20th century, it had dropped to 5%, as you can see on this graph here. And as you can see by today, there's almost nobody in terms of statistical significance employed in the agriculture sector. So agriculture has gone through a major transformation, and a lot of those jobs went into the manufacturing sector. And we see the same trend in that manufacturing line. So manufacturing just 60 years ago employed 30% of all Americans, And today, you can see that coming right down to below 10%, and soon that will look like the agriculture sector, and very few people will still be employed in that sector. So those jobs have been going extinct for a long time, and the question is, where do they go? So 47% of US jobs are forecast to become extinct in the next decade. And the question is that your job and mine?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what has been evolving is that obviously some of these jobs have moved. We've seen a lot of offshoring and outsourcing of jobs over the last decade, and it would have been fair to say in the last decade that a lot of jobs went to places like Asia and China, where manufacturing was a lot cheaper and economies of scale were much better. But even there, even in Asia, jobs are becoming extinct. So 25% of all manufacturing jobs in China, which equates to 30 million workers, have become extinct in the last decade.
Wow, you wouldn't expect that, would you? It's thinking about the way that the media talks about those manufacturing jobs in China as well, but in fact they are actually becoming extinct too.
Exactly. And you think, well, if they're getting extinct from going to China, well, where are they going? And this is where they're going. They're becoming automated. So robotics have become a huge replacer of jobs, and we can expect that a lot of manufacturing and lower level blue collar jobs will become automated in the coming few years. So for example here, Foxconn, who is Apple's manufacturer of product in China, already has 10,000 robots, but plans to increase that to 300,000 in the next 5 years. And the overall worldwide spend on robotics has already increased by 347% to 67 billion over the last few years. And that's a rate that will become exponential. So we expect to see a lot more manufacturing jobs become automated. But interestingly, manufacturing and blue-collar jobs is not the only place where robots and automation will take over. What we're increasingly seeing now is that knowledge work is also lending itself to being automated. So again, this type of work was offshored and outsourced a lot over the last few years, but we're finding now that with artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things building the capabilities of what we're able to do, that knowledge workers are also starting to be affected by automation.
So that actually brings us to our first poll, and so it'd be interesting to get the thoughts from the audience as to how likely is your job to become extinct in the next decade. Based upon some of the insights that Sylvia has shared here, perhaps you might have changed your mind a little bit just from some of those facts. So actually in the GoToMeeting window, you'll be able to vote for your thoughts on this, and we'll just give you a minute or so to be able to put your thoughts forward. And perhaps while you're thinking about that, one thing to consider, particularly for higher ed, is how there's been such a movement of the classes that obviously had previously been undertaken directly on campus, where there's such a movement to those classes being online. That has an impact obviously on some of the workers at your institutions, I'm sure, but it's not just the faculty members or the like who are going to be impacted by that. And that's only just one example.
I'm very interested to see the results of this poll, Rob.
Yeah, well, perhaps we'll give it 5 more seconds and then let's take a look. Okay, so taking a look at those results now, the vast majority of the audience are thinking that it's possible that their job could become extinct in the next decade, but unlikely. And then there's 21% of people that have said that they can't see that happening at all. What's your take on that, Sylvia?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a different result. If you were looking out into the commercial sector, that might look quite different. But I'm not surprised that people think that there's a possibility, but it's more unlikely at this stage that jobs in the higher education sector would be eliminated. I think what we need to keep in mind is that the entire world is subject to the changes that we're experiencing at the moment.
Yeah.
So the likelihood of any one industry being completely protected from that is quite low. And as in the past where we've been unable to predict the quantum of change and we've tended to underestimate it,
yeah,
that is also likely to be the case. And certainly every industry will have its take on that. But I think we can, even if extinction is not the end result, job transformation is certainly likely.
Yeah, definitely. And perhaps the rate of change will be different by industry as well. And so perhaps in higher ed, it may still be coming.
Exactly, exactly. But why don't we have a look at some jobs that we already know are actually disappearing. So, so the chart that's up on the screen now gives us a bit of an indication of some of the jobs that are on death row. And it makes a difference the extent to which jobs are easier to automate and not easy to automate. And I think this is also why the higher education sector would be considering that it's harder to automate a lot of the jobs that are available in that sector. But if you look at the chart on the left-hand side, you can see that some occupations have a very high probability of being automated and disappearing from human interaction. At a 0.99% probability, it's almost entirely, well,
it's happening.
It's happening,
yep.
It's literally happening. And the probability percentages go down from there. So that you see the jobs on the right-hand side tend to be those that do have more human interaction. And in fact, I think if we have a look just there, we see that human resources managers, which might be a relief to some of us, are actually quite low in terms of the probability of being automated. And that's because a lot of the work that HR does have more of that human interaction and that human element. Having said that, technology is transforming the HR function, and we will see later on some of the findings in Talent Lab 1 that show what are some of the distinct differences about HR capabilities that are going to be necessary for the future.
Great.
So one of the things that we had a look at in the lab was some of the research that has come out of the business schools around the world. And for those of you that are aware of Linda Grattan's work at London Business School and the Future of Work Consortium, you would know that there are some quite dynamic impacts of changes in the future of work. So for starters, one thing that you can think about, Rob, is that the kids that you have today are very likely to live to age 100. That will become the average age, the average lifespan. But we'll also be expecting to be working at least till we're about 80. So much, much longer work life than what we're used to.
Wow.
In fact, the hours of work that your children will work in their life will increase from our workload of about 124,000 hours in our lifetime to about 224,000 hours of work for your kids.
Quite a significant change there, yeah.
The other thing that will happen is that the way that we work will vary very much. So we're used to a traditional mindset where you do your education at the beginning of your working life, then you go to work, and then you retire. In the future, we'll have much more of a portfolio life and portfolio careers, where we're actually in a continuous cycle of learning and change and new careers. And so we build up a portfolio of careers rather than having one fixed career that we commit to, which is great for the higher education sector, of course, because it's constantly driving people back to learning and reinventing their skills.
Yep, skilling and reskilling and making sure they're ready for those changing roles, absolutely.
Exactly, because as you see, the shelf life of the skills that we have today is shrinking dramatically. So what's relevant in our skill set today will quickly be outdated, and we need to keep topping up our skills. So let's have a look at the key areas that we looked at in Talent Lab 1, which is the future of work, how HR technology is changing, and what are all of the implications for the future of HR itself. So what we'll look at in terms of the future of work is how the workforce composition is actually changing, what workplace technologies are impacting that, how the demographics of the workforce is impacting the differences that we'll see in future, and just how the workspace itself is changing. And I know that we're sitting in a very modern office here today, surrounded by things that the workplace of the past certainly wouldn't have had: coffee machines, lounges, more collaborative open areas, very different to
standing desks, all sorts of things. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So let's have a look into these. So in terms of workforce composition, the first one, what's becoming very clear is that the standard full-time or part-time jobs of the past are breaking down into component parts. So rather than having a complete job, jobs will be broken down into tasks and will be completed at a task level by different types of workers. So we'll expect people to be working more virtually, be working more remotely, be working on contracted components, be working on projects, rather than be dedicated to one full-time job that they commit wholly to. So we expect quite some differences, and of course you can see that the robots are there again, and that automation will actually have quite an impact on this workforce composition. The interesting thing about this picture is that if you're a HR executive or a HR manager, you've got a very disparate workforce in future to try to bring together and to engage in a culture, to try to achieve performance out of, and so it's not going to be as straightforward to manage the workforce of the future. We have to get a little bit more creative and dynamic about how we do that. Yeah,
it's been interesting actually, a number of the schools that I've been speaking with recently, the challenges that they're facing, whether that's hiring international faculty or first of all just being able to find them overseas, then be able to attract them, work through relocations, all of those type of challenges that are just the facts of the global workplace now, and certainly it's happening in higher ed. And even things like virtual workers, probably a few years ago it wouldn't have really made a lot of sense to have remote workers working in roles that traditionally were based on campus, but these days some of the leading institutions are hiring a lot of workers who are actually going to be working remote for 90% of the time in their particular roles.
Which is all enabled by technology, of course, and gives us a very exciting range of options for the future. But obviously, it also challenges the existing paradigms in which we're working. So it's got a two-tailed effect. Certainly, as the research houses show, though, the trend is very much towards more contractors, freelancers, more contingent workers. And we certainly expect that over the next 5 years, a significant portion of the workforce will be working in these more flexible ways.
Interesting.
Of course, the other thing that we're all aware of, because we're living it, is that we're working in a very multi-generational workforce these days. We have a full 4 generations in our workplace of today, which is very different from the past. And this is the first time ever in history where we've got a generation coming into the workforce that actually has some superior skills to the people that are already in it. And of course, I'm alluding to technology. So as the millennials come in, we can see that the skills that they bring in terms of being digital natives and quick with technology, and in fact expecting a lot of technology, as you see here, to be part of their work experience, we'll find that there's a lot of cross-fertilisation that happens as a result of that. So a boomer's mentor could well be a millennial generation person, and that's a very appropriate thing in this workplace.
Yeah.
The other really exciting thing that we see, as I mentioned before, is this actual transformation of workspace. So we've worked out that both science and technology have told us that the best way to get productivity and performance is not actually by sticking people in a tiny cubicle and with grey and fluorescent lights and a very sort of sheltered workspace, but to open it up, to make it more engaging and creative, to make it accessible, and to build workspaces where collaboration can occur. That's where we get creativity, that's where we get new ideas, and it's where we get the social satisfaction of actually coming to work.
Yeah, being able to interact with people and really be able to engage and collaborate, which we're seeing a lot of. Yeah.
And just breaking down that difference between what it means to be at home and to be at work.
Yep.
So we want the workplace increasingly, and millennials certainly want the workplace to feel more like a place that they want to be, rather than somewhere that they need to go to perform their work.
Yep.
Which is why this image looks probably more like somebody's sitting room than it does the traditional office.
Yeah, exactly. And it probably actually leads well into the expectations of those millennials, the technology that they'll be using, which we'll touch on in a few moments as well.
Yeah, yeah. So as we move now into the HR technology section, so we ask ourselves here whether what we're actually seeing at work in terms of the technologies that we're using is equivalent to the benchmarks that are being set by consumer technologies. So I don't know about you, Rob, but I can't go anywhere without my smartphone and my tablet. And increasingly, that's the expectation, particularly the millennials have, that they'll be able to access technology at work with the same type of interface, same type of ease and access that they do their smartphones and tablets.
Yeah.
Which is kind of challenging if you haven't got that.
Exactly, exactly. I think every single day I hear that there's that need for whether it's social media interaction or mobile capabilities in the technology that we offer. It really is just the expectation today.
And if you think that the internet has only been around for 25 years or so, and what we've experienced in that time, the growth of that has been absolutely phenomenal. I want to share a story with you that comes out of The Second Machine Age, which is a book I'd highly recommend to you. It's a fascinating read. But it takes us into how the pace at which technology is actually evolving and how the convergence of what hardware and software are able to do now is really setting us on an exponential path of change driven by technology. So there's a story in The Second Machine Age about the second half of the chessboard. Do you know how many squares there are on a chessboard, Rob?
Oh, I think maybe there might be about 64.
Well, that's a good guess if you're guessing. Yeah, so the game of chess was originally invented in the 6th century in India during the time of the Gupta Empire by a peasant. And he took the game that he had invented to the emperor and showed the emperor this game of chess, so 64 squares and the various chess pieces. And the emperor loved it. He thought it was the most beautiful and elegant game that he had ever come across. And to reward this peasant, he said, "You can name your price for this game. I love it so much." And the rather cunning peasant said to the emperor that all I want is enough rice to feed my family. And the emperor obviously thought that was a pretty fair trade. And so in order to effect that, the peasant said, for each square on the chessboard, I'd like some rice. So for the first square on the chessboard, give me 1 grain of rice. And double that for each square on the chessboard. So the second square I get 2, for the third square I get 4, for the fourth square, and so on and so on. Now, we know that when you start doubling and doubling and doubling, you get to some pretty big numbers. And certainly by the time that you get to the first half of the chessboard, you get through the first 32 squares, that actually adds up to 4 billion grains of rice. Now, that sounds like a lot of rice. Yeah.
Sure does, yeah.
It's about the size of a large field packed full of rice.
Yep.
And we can get our heads around those sorts of numbers So 4 billion, we talk in billions, and those are numbers that we can grapple with, we can comprehend. But when you keep doubling and doubling and doubling those numbers, and as you get into the second half of the chessboard, it actually starts getting into numbers that we can no longer comprehend. Yeah. So, in fact, at the point of 64 squares on the chessboard, you're up to a number which is 2 to the power of 64 minus 1, which is, if you turn that into grains of rice, is more rice than has ever been produced on planet Earth in its history. So it's actually not possible.
And so how did he address this?
So, well, as the story goes, the peasant was beheaded once the emperor worked out this trick. But the analogy of the chessboard, the second half of the chessboard, is that that is where we have just moved now in terms of the evolution of technology.
Yeah.
So everything that we've experienced through the growth of technology in the last century has taken us to this point, and we're about at the 32nd square of the chessboard.
Yeah.
Which means the part where it starts to get really huge and basically unfathomable to us right now is the area that we're moving into. So we're just at a point where the internet, social, mobile, cloud, big data and analytics are becoming familiar to us, and they're foundational in terms of what you need in order to collaborate with these technologies. But we're only at the beginning of what's possible.
Yeah, it's scary to think of what might be to come then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's scary and it's exciting because, frankly, I think, by the time I get to my old age, I'm going to have so much technology that's going to help me through that.
Yep.
As a result of this. But we're actually on quite a steep learning path. So we're moving now into the emerging innovations area. But as you can see, as we swing around into areas that are still that are quite disruptive and unexplored, this slide talks to the fact that, here be dragons, that we're actually going like when Columbus and the explorers explored the Earth, and before the maps were actually set, there were points on the boundaries where beyond that you didn't know what was there. It was a total unknown, and for all you knew, there could be dragons out there.
Yeah.
And for all we know today, there could be technology dragons that are out there because we just don't know what they're capable of.
Yeah.
And you see it already in terms of security issues, privacy issues, things that we know that we have to deal with, but we're not on top of yet. We're working our way through it, and there's a lot more of that to come.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty transformational and phenomenal time, and already in terms of how these things are transforming into our day-to-day world. Your smartphone has got so much more capability than the largest computers 30 years ago were capable of. We're walking around with obviously phones, tablets, wearables now, technology that allows us to be online and accessing that technology 24/7 around the globe. We're seeing for the first time that even in remote places and in the third world where technology you would never have thought would be realised, people now have smartphones and are able to access the internet, perhaps never even having seen a computer like you and I do.
They've skipped part of that technology, haven't they? Have gone straight to smartphones, and internet's being beamed down from satellites directly to them in the remote areas. Yeah.
Exactly. So they've leapfrogged totally over the standard technologies that we're used to, and they wouldn't even know how to turn on a PC.
Yeah.
But they're using their smartphones. So it's obviously creating an enabled environment unlike anything that we've ever had before.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah.
And in terms of some of the technology that I've seen, I suppose on a similar mould, is once again where there's HR technology that is really the expectation of users, where they want to have something that's consumer friendly. So whether that's someone applying for a job, they want to make sure that they can actually apply for a job end-to-end on their mobile device. And there's technologies called responsive design, for example, which means that whether you access a career site on your iPhone versus your iPad or tablet, versus your desktop, you'll actually get an experience which is tailored specifically to that device. Taking it another step further, I actually talk a lot about QR codes and how they're changing the game for mobile usage right across higher education. I think I often tell the story of a few years ago when some of our product team at PageUp came to me and they said, hey, we've developed this new QR code functionality to allow people to scan codes on their phone to apply for a job. I think I might have even actually laughed at them, I must admit, and I said, no one's going to use that, that's a bit crazy. And that was only, I think, 3 years ago, and now posted all around campuses, right around the world. You see QR codes, and whether it's students applying for jobs or faculty even, they can just scan that QR code, go through a job application, and then you can even track where those individuals have actually found that advertisement, and you can see that, oh, people are applying for those student positions right next to the cafeteria or wherever it happens to be.
And I think that's a great example of how, you know, what we think is science fiction today in terms of what's coming up actually becomes pretty normal pretty quickly in this world. So what we're doing today would have been the science fiction of 20 years ago, and here we are. Yeah,
absolutely. And then the third example here is a consumer-friendly onboarding experience. So this is where there's technology that's available right now where individuals, once they've been given a letter of offer, rather than having to wait for FedEx to post it out to them and it take a couple of days, and you might potentially have a counter offer. There's technology available which can allow someone not only to just accept their letter of offer, but perhaps even have a tour of the campus that they're about to be starting at, or get a welcome video from the dean or the provost or the president of the university. And that sort of technology is probably Jetsons-like technology only a few years ago, but it's very much the norm.
It becomes a base expectation, and so the threshold of expectation is just increasing phenomenally. And even if you think about in your own personal experience, the tolerance that you've got for, you know, technology that's slow or processes that are slow, you know, when you have to fill out forms and if you manually have to do things, we've got a lot less tolerance for that than our parents have. Yeah. And that's because we're just used to doing things fast and instantly, as our technology now allows us to, and that will become the baseline expectation of the future employee.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then it's probably a good opportunity for another poll to get some of the ideas from you all as the audience. And be interesting to understand how ready you think your institution is to be able to leverage opportunities in the digital era.
And this, I guess, will be interesting in terms of the level of evolution of enterprise technology in institutions now. So, you know, we see quite a disparity between what different industries are investing in terms of technology. Obviously, some have a much higher expectation or investment in their technology, in their supporting technologies, and others lower. What's your prediction in terms of the higher education sector, Rob?
I think it's going to be a little bit mixed. I think that some of the some people I've been speaking to recently have said, "Oh, we've had a long way to go." Other institutions, I think, have really embraced technology and are really getting ahead of the game. So maybe give a couple more seconds, and I'm going to be very excited to see the results of this poll.
Okay, here we go.
So there we have it. Interestingly, spot on 50% of the audience does feel that they have quite a way to go to leverage opportunities in the digital era. A percentage do actually feel that they're ready and willing and able to move, and then some ready and willing, but perhaps not so able just yet.
Yeah, so you know, obviously the mindset and the intent has to be there first before before the actual enabling and the implementation can follow. And you know, I think that level of understanding that there is a gap between the current state and the future state that you need to get to, and that is a constant gap that needs to be filled because it's such a dynamic area. I think that's a healthy place to be. So I think the fact that a lot of organisations seem to think that there's an appetite and an acknowledgement that there is a need to be more progressive with technology is a good thing. And obviously there are lots of challenges in terms of implementing the things that need to be done. But,
and sometimes I think from what I hear, there's sometimes the will, but then there's also the challenge of being able to take the rest of the stakeholder group on the journey as well, and be able to influence and provide the reasoning for why we need to change too.
But that's a core skill of HR, isn't it, Rob? So
it sure is.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's. In fact, you're not organisations aren't alone in terms of seeing this need to emphasise more investment in technology, and Gartner, who do a lot of research in the technology space, clearly state that over the next few years, organisations really do need to look at their talent management strategies and unify those in order to be able to bring together all of the different facets of technology that they will need to support a disparate workforce, or they'll risk losing that talent altogether. So, as you said earlier, talent is in the global market now. I know from organisations in Australia and Southeast Asia and Europe, where we also have our offices, that there's a lot of transition between countries in terms of academic staff, and particularly senior academic staff, and that global market will only increase.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So let's look at the final component, which was actually the future of HR, which is obviously very close to the heart of HR people. And you could be forgiven in the HR sector, if you're a HR professional, for feeling a little bit beaten up these days. It seems like every other day there's something wrong with some HR process. There's better ways of doing things. There are best practices that don't seem to work. Performance management is an issue. Assessment is an issue. It's kind of a tough time to be in HR. A lot of HR departments are being asked to downsize. A lot are being asked to show the value that they can add. A lot of them being asked to be using more metrics and be able to actually quantify business value and organisational value. So it is an interesting time to be in HR. What we found in the Talent Lab is that there are some emerging models of HR for the future, and we expect them to be very different from the way that HR has evolved in the past. So in the past, we've had a function that has been very administrative in its basis, has also been very much about compliance, very much about policing policies and making sure that organisations are managed within a box.
Yeah.
And to an extent that will continue to be part of the remit of HR, but I think a lot more is being asked of HR. And so let's have a look at these three models. So the first model is the extinction model. So back to our dinosaur friend at the beginning. And some organisations, I doubt we will see this in higher education, but some organisations are actually talking about eliminating their HR function altogether. And for the first time ever, they can do it.
Yeah, that's pretty dramatic. It's a scary thought in a way, isn't it?
It is, and it's actually happening. So this is where organisations are devolving a lot of the HR and talent management functions into line management. So managers are taking on board the responsibility for recruitment and performance management and even succession. They're eliminating some processes, some HR processes altogether, so streamlining the HR process. They're automating everything that they can because clearly technology is more scalable and cheaper than people. And they're outsourcing other components. So if you take that batch together, you can pretty much eliminate your HR function. Now that will work differently in different industries and in different organisations in each of those industries, but it is definitely a model that some are pursuing. The second, where HR is in a state of metamorphosis, is probably a little bit more likely for most organisations, where they're taking the benefits of automation and adding more value. So they're adding more of that human component, where HR is using technology to coach and empower business managers, line managers and employees themselves to be self-sufficient in HR and talent management, and freeing them, emancipating them from that need to be involved in a lot of fixed processes that they have been in the past. And they're also becoming strategic advisors. So they're looking at workforce planning, they're looking at future forecasting of the kind of roles and the kind of workers that they'll need, and how best to prepare the organisation for that. In the evolution model, similar but a little bit different, where current HR functions evolve to take on a different frame. And this talks to some of the key skill differences that we found are being flagged as essential requirements for HR in the future. So much more of an understanding of the business within which they're working. And even if it's in the higher education sector, it's understanding the business of higher education.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So understanding the environment that you're in, the competitive environment that the organisation is in, that the institution is in, and understanding how it ticks, what actually makes it work, what are the critical things that you need to be able to manipulate to be a profitable organisation, or to be an organisation that delivers to its stakeholder needs. Essential element of understanding for HR, not just for the business managers.
Yeah, definitely.
The second is marketing, so becoming much more aware of the fact that HR plays a role as being the external advocate for the organisation, and should use marketing skills and expertise to implement that. So that's where you see a lot of social media work starting to come into play.
Yes.
And the third key element that's changing in terms of the evolution of HR is becoming much more quantitative and data scientist. So we're actually seeing job titles such as talent scientist, which is all about understanding the metrics of the workforce and using that to give line managers and business managers the tools to be able to manage the workforce in a proactive way rather than just reactively.
Definitely. Well, we're seeing a fair bit of that actually at a lot of schools right around the country. And in fact, even when we're thinking about that marketing piece, whether it's using things like social media or LinkedIn or Pinterest or whatever it happens to be, there's technology out there that can really help the organisation be I suppose a employer of choice, just by making sure that people are aware of what's out there. And then you can even use that brand awareness to be more proactive in sourcing. And so there's an example here of using candidate relationship management technology to be able to proactively outreach to potential candidates. And once again, that's leveraging marketing skills, business skills, and really being able to be a lot more strategic in the HR function. And then in terms of big data and analytics, or big data and analytics, I could say, there's once again technology out there which is currently available and being used to be able to make business decisions. So whether that's doing things like analysing potential career paths throughout the organisation using big data concepts, or potentially, as shown in the screenshot here, just being able to see things like the sourcing volumes over time to understand where my best bang for buck going to be when it comes to social media posting, or when are those peak periods going to be where I need to ensure that I've got enough recruiters ready to be able to work during those peak times. Once again, they're concepts that have been around for a long time, but the technology is there to be able to make HR's life easier and help with that evolution.
Yeah, I think this multi-dimensional sort of skill set is reflective also of the multi-dimensional skills that we have in the workforce through those 4 different generations. And it really is a time where you can't possibly be expected to be across everything that you need to know in HR now, but you do need to collaborate with the people that are in the in HR teams, and bring into your HR team the skills that are missing, so that as a composite you actually do have the requisite skills for the future. And when you're able to do, present the kind of data that you've got on the screen there, for example, at the moment, that's the time when senior business leaders and the organisation's leaders stop and actually start looking at this and taking it very, very seriously, because it's really about workforce prediction and being able to align what the institution needs and the talent that is delivering to those needs.
It really brings it all together, doesn't it?
It does, it does. And I think that's a great thing. I think we've come a long, long way in what's possible in HR technology in the last few years.
Fantastic. Well, time for our final poll. And the final poll here is now getting a sense from everything that we've been through today, is your HR function reviewing its approach to align to the workplace of the future? So I think it's going to be very interesting to see some of the results here too.
And you obviously speak to a lot of HR people in the higher education sector, Rob. What's your expectation of how this question will be answered?
I think that there's going to be a lot to the positive, but perhaps it's more in the reviewing, thinking about it, perhaps not as many taking action right away. So I think there's an opportunity to be ahead of the game for a lot of schools.
Okay, why don't we have a look?
Okay, so interesting. I pretty much picked it.
Well, okay, so there's obviously some organisations that aren't looking to change anything now, but by and large, the majority are definitely either looking at it or thinking that they ought to be. And I think it's healthy to be asking the question, to be looking inward and saying, are we delivering the best HR solution that we can at the moment, and what else can we do to improve it? Because I think the HR has got such a crucial and fundamental role to play if it's done well, that it would be a travesty to actually have HR extinct from organisations. I think they would be losing out. So I think it's great to see that so many people are either taking action, thinking about it, or in some stage of that process.
Yeah, definitely.
So Rob, that is some of the insights that we got out of the first Talent Lab. So the Talent Lab asks questions. Talent Lab 1 asked the question of, in a hyper-connected world, is HR disconnected? And we looked at things like technology and science that we've been talking about that are transforming the HR function.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what's going to be the next lab? It's
Well, funny you should ask, Rob. So right now we just launched the second lab, which is looking at the extent to which engagement is really a factor in the future of the workforce. And we're specifically asking the question of whether the war for talent has become a crusade for engagement. And that looks at the extent to which talent acquisition and going out searching and fighting the battle to get talent in is equally reflected with what we do once employees actually join the organisation. So are we actually investing as much in engaging the workforce to retain it and to maximise its productivity and performance as we are in the initial attraction? So it's all about, do we focus more on the bells and whistles at the beginning of the process, or do we actually roll our sleeves up and do the hard work of managing employees well?
Great. Well, it's going to be, I just can't wait to find out what that really brings out. So it's a really exciting lab.
Well, to keep an eye on it, Rob, all you need to do is go to pageuptalentlab.com. There you'll see the contributions of all the HR directors, subject matter experts and analysts that we have in the lab contributing their pieces. And it's a dynamic lab. It changes every couple of days. And we'd love as many people as possible to participate in that and see where the future of work in HR is going.
Fantastic. Well, if there is anybody who's been part of our webinar today and would be interested in participating with Sylvia in the next Talent Lab, please do feel free to reach out to us, and we'd of course love to get your input to ensure that we're furthering all of our knowledge in the Talent Lab itself.
Well, I hope we haven't frightened people too much about the future, Rob. I hope we can see through, some of the challenges in it and actually tackle it with the positive eyes of taking it on as an opportunity, because I really do think it's an exciting time.
Oh, it most definitely is. I think that the future is very, very bright, and I'm just excited being a technologist as well by all of the exciting things that technology can help HR with, and I don't think it's really going to replace it. I think it's really going to be there as a tool to be able to help HR take its next step to being able to drive the business to its goals as well. Well, thank you again, Sylvia, for joining us today for our webinar. It's been a real pleasure, and we definitely hope to get you back here for the second Talent Lab. As I mentioned, we'll be actually distributing a recording of our webinar today in follow-up from our session, and please do feel free to reach out to PageUp for any further questions, or if you'd simply like to be involved in the next Talent Lab itself.
It's been really great being here today, Rob. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, everybody, for joining.